Okay, let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive into the source material you've provided us with.
Right. Lots of notes, articles, research, all centered on movement leadership and disciple making, mainly in a religious context.
And our mission really is to pull out the core ideas for you, the listener. Find the surprising bits, the practical insights hidden in there.
Exactly. And it kicks off with a pretty challenging idea right away.
It does, yeah. This concept that everyone is supposed to be a disciple maker, that it's not something you can just, well, delegate.
It really makes you pause and think, doesn't it? What if the fundamental work, the engine of a movement, isn't just for the leaders or the pros?
It involves everyone, top to bottom. That's quite a premise to start with.
It is. And that foundational principle, it's absolutely central to everything else in the material you shared.
The argument being that this was Jesus's plan all along, that all followers get involved.
Yes, that's the core argument. Not just a select few, people with special titles or years of training.
So it's not just for clergy or full-time missionaries. The sources really push back on that.
They really do. They point out that even Jesus, the leader of the whole thing, he was constantly making disciples himself.
And Paul, too, leading teams, planting churches all over the place.
But still doing the core work. He didn't just manage from afar. He was hands-on, making disciples.
And the source material highlights how simple those first steps can be.
Yeah.
Basically just telling people your story, how you encountered Jesus.
And inviting them. Yeah, it strips it right back. It's not presented as needing some complex seminary course just to get started.
Just sharing your experience, extending an invitation.
Right. And the material is quite emphatic that every single believer, everyone involved in a movement, think administrators, office staff, regular members, everyone is meant to be actively doing this.
It can't be done by proxy. That seems to be the key phrase.
Exactly. So if you accept that premise that everyone's a disciple maker, then the focus shifts to leadership.
And how that's defined. Not by position, but by action.
Precisely. The source brings in Steve Addison's 5 levels of movement leadership. Should we walk through those quickly?
Yeah, let's do that. How does the source describe them?
Okay, so these levels are all about making things happen, about active participation. It's very different from static titles.
Right.
Level 1 is seed sowers and disciple makers. That's the base level, includes everyone, even those at higher levels. They never stop doing this.
Okay, foundational. What's next?
2 is church planters. These are people who don't just make disciples, but they equip them and gather them into new church communities.
So forming new groups. Got it.
3 is church multipliers. These are planters who actually equip and release other planters, creating a network, expanding the work.
So multiplication, not just addition.
Exactly. Then 4 is multiplication trainers, more experienced people who focus specifically on equipping those multipliers, training the trainers, essentially.
Well, and the top level.
5 is movement catalysts. These are the folks taking on the broadest view, aiming to see whole movements ignite across maybe an unreached people group or a large region.
Because the common thread is function, activity, not the title on your business card.
Absolutely. It's all about what you're doing to contribute to the movement's growth and spread.
And what does the source say this means for existing structures like denominations?
Well, it connects this action-based model directly to the idea of restructuring existing organizations to function more like movements.
Which sounds like a pretty big deal.
Oh, it is. The source suggests it's not just tweaking things. It requires significant shifts, reskilling people for these active roles, changing the organizational structure to support multiplication, reconfiguring where the priorities lie, away from just maintenance.
Which leads us maybe naturally to what the source calls the painful reality. Why is it often so hard, even for people with good intentions, to actually live out this everyone makes disciples idea?
Yeah, this part of the material doesn't pull any punches. It gets quite candid about how traditional structures, the sheer busyness of roles,
Even for administrators, staff,
pastors, and members too, how all that can make it incredibly difficult, almost impossible sometimes, to actively engage in making disciples firsthand.
They mention things like being consumed by governance meetings, admin tasks, policies, travel.
Right. Things that might be needed to run an institution, but they pull people away from that frontline mission work.
And besides the time pressure, the source also mentions people feeling, ill-equipped.
Yeah, that's a big one. A widespread feeling among members and even many leaders that they just don't have the skills. They might see evangelism or disciple making as something specialized.
Something for the professionals, people with seminary degrees or specific training.
Exactly. So there's this tendency, maybe subconscious sometimes, to delegate it, or just assume it's primarily someone else's job.
And the source calls the impact of that devastating.
It does, because it leads to this lack of broad involvement. Pastors get caught in the middle.
How so?
Well, they might feel pressure from leadership structures to show results, growth, program success. But then they also face expectations from members that, evangelism is the pastor's main job, not necessarily theirs.
So the pastor feels judged, maybe ineffective, but sees everyone else as kind of swamped or disengaged too.
Right. The source paints this picture of a situation with no winners. It's quite stark. Yeah. And it circles right back to that fundamental problem.
Disciple making cannot be delegated. Not if you want a multiplying movement.
That's the bottom line according to this material.
Okay, so if many common structures kind of struggle with this, where does the source point us for a working model? An example.
It really zooms in on Paul's approach in the New Testament. It presents his methods as a kind of blueprint for building something sustainable, something that multiplies effectively.
Right, and it breaks down different aspects of his model.
Yes, several key things. Team formation is a big one.
Okay, let's start there. How did Paul build his teams, according to the source?
Well, the sources emphasize these small, mobile, agile teams working in specific geographic areas. But the really interesting part is who he brought onto the team.
Not just experienced people.
He had experienced people like Barnabas or Silas, sure. But crucially, Paul added new members from the harvest, people who were new believers right there in the areas they were working.
So not just recruiting from existing churches or Bible schools back home.
Exactly. He was identifying and equipping people on the spot where the mission was actually happening. People like Timothy, Titus, Luke.
And the source notes their diverse backgrounds. Familiarity with the local scene.
Yes, that seems strategic. People with mixed backgrounds, local connections. They had an advantage in understanding the culture and opening doors. Building the team was part of harvesting.
That seems to connect really closely with the next point the source makes about internship, or learning by doing.
Absolutely. The argument is strong here. Essential ministry skills, making disciples, planting churches, equipping others, are best learned through actually doing it, through experience alongside mentors.
Not just in a classroom.
Right, more like an apprenticeship. Paul modeled everything.
Like what specifically?
His leadership style, the source calls it cruciform, meaning centered on sacrifice and service. His work ethic, the tent making to support himself sometimes, even his vulnerability.
So the team saw it all firsthand.
They saw how he interacted with people, heard his testimony, watched him handle challenges. The source gives a modern example, too, a pastor taking small groups of potential leaders out with him.
Visiting homes, hospitals, leading discussions.
Yeah, real-world ministry. And after doing that for maybe 6 months, they could team up with others, and the pastor mentors a new group. It creates this multiplying effect of experienced people.
So simple, reproducible methods, learned through practice. What about making it last? Sustainability. How did Paul ensure the work continued after his team left?
Sustainability was key. The sources highlight two main things. First, planting reproducible churches, often starting in the households of these persons of peace.
People who were receptive and opened their homes.
Exactly. Those homes became the simple, affordable venues for the new church communities. No need for fancy buildings initially.
And the second factor?
Affirming the natural local leadership that emerged within those new communities. Not importing leaders, but recognizing those history God was raising up right there.
The source mentions Lydia and the jailer in Philippi as examples, getting leadership roles quite quickly.
Yes, it does. And notes that Luke might have stayed behind for a bit in Philippi, suggesting maybe some initial oversight or coaching, but the responsibility was given fast.
Responsibility for what, exactly?
Well, the source stresses that Paul placed full responsibility for the core mission and church functions, things like baptizing new believers, celebrating the Lord's Supper, handling internal disputes onto these new disciples and churches themselves.
He didn't try to control it all centrally? Or send money from headquarters?
No. The emphasis is that Paul generally didn't bring external funds. He operated on the principle that the people and the finances needed would come from the harvest itself.
From the community being reached.
Yes. The source mentions a UK example, a cafe church refurbished and staffed by volunteers from the local community they were trying to reach. Resources emerging locally.
Okay, that brings us squarely to the topic of money and resources. The source describes it as both a potential curse and a blessing.
It's a really potent section. It doesn't shy away from the complexities.
Let's start with the curse side. What negative examples does the source bring up?
It talks about instances where money has clearly hindered or even stalled movements, damaged the church's reputation, distorted the message.
Any specifics mentioned?
Yes. The Rwanda church closures in 2018 are cited, partly linked to concerns about preachers enriching themselves. And it mentions descriptions of some business churches in parts of Africa focusing heavily on wealth and health messages, maybe at the expense of the broader gospel.
It even goes back to Jesus' time.
It does. Recalls his strong reaction against those exploiting the temple system for profit, and his critique of showy public displays of giving that were more about image than generosity.
Okay, so that's the potential downside, the curse. What about the blessing? How can money actually help the mission?
The blessing side focuses on how simple provision, basic expenses like food, drink, a place to stay provided by the people Jesus and his disciples met, actually created an opening for mission.
How so?
It aligns with this phrase from one related book: if you can eat, you can make disciples. Just receiving hospitality, sharing a meal, it breaks down barriers, it becomes a relational bridge, especially, as the source says, in a care-for-yourself world.
Makes sense. But what about larger expenses? Funding full-time workers going into new areas?
The source acknowledges that reaching new districts does involve costs beyond just personal time. It points out these were sometimes covered by others, like the women who financially supported Jesus' ministry, mentioned in Luke 8.
Or Paul asking the Roman church for help with his planned trip to Spain.
Exactly. And it also brings up Paul's instruction in Galatians 6.6 that those receiving spiritual teaching should share all good things, including material support, with their instructors.
So acknowledging the legitimacy of supporting those doing the teaching and ministry work.
Right, which then leads into a deeper dive using 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul lays out some principles about support that the source presents as quite challenging to maybe more traditional ways of thinking.
Okay, what's the first principle from 1 Corinthians 9 that the source highlights?
Principle 1 is this: the right to receive support belongs to those who are directly involved in the work, the planting and tending.
Paul uses farming analogies. A serger's pay.
Yes, like a farmer eating the fruit they grow, or a shepherd drinking milk from the flock they care for. The source applies this very directly.
How?
It raises a pointed question about organizations where a lot of the funding goes to salaries for administrators or others who aren't directly making new disciples.
Implying that maybe they should be, based on Paul's reasoning.
It strongly suggests that yes, or at least it challenges the allocation of resources, if the primary focus is meant to be disciple-making multiplication. The source suggests it would actually be refreshing if leaders were directly involved, experiencing the fruit of the work firsthand.
Okay, that's principle 1. What's the second one from 1 Corinthians 9?
Principle 2 is that even though the right exists, claiming that right to support can sometimes hinder the gospel.
Hinder it how?
By creating a perception problem. The risk that people will dismiss the message because they think the messenger is just in it for the money. That accusation, oh, you're just paid to say this.
And the source uses Paul's own life as the prime example here, right?
It does. Paul often chose not to claim his right. He worked, made tents, sometimes day and night, specifically to avoid being a financial burden, and so he could offer the gospel free of charge.
He didn't want anything to get in the way of the message itself.
Exactly, and the source includes an observation, I think, from Bob Logan, suggesting that if a pastor's salary is secure, whether or not new disciples are being made or new churches planted, well, it might unintentionally lessen the drive or urgency for that planting to happen.
Just to be clear, the source isn't saying pastors are overpaid.
No, it clarifies that. It's more about the implication when financial security isn't closely linked to the actual outcome of disciple-making and multiplication. A structural observation, really.
Okay, so tying these threads together, especially looking at Paul's model, the source lands on a pretty fundamental principle about where resources come from.
Yes, and it might feel counterintuitive to some. It's this core idea. The primary resources needed for mission are found in the harvest itself.
Wow. Explain that a bit more. What resources?
Basically, everything crucial. The source argues the key resources, the future disciple makers, the emerging leaders, the teachers, and the necessary finances are not mainly sitting inside existing church buildings or denominational bank accounts.
They're out there, among the people who haven't yet connected with the existing church.
That's the argument. They're found in the harvest. And mobilizing those resources, letting new disciples and new churches contribute from the start, keeps everything focused outward and connected to the core mission.
So bringing all this together then, thinking about you, our listener, what are the main takeaways from this deep dive into the material you provided.
Well, it paints a really compelling and sometimes challenging picture. It starkly contrasts leadership based on static positions and delegation.
With this dynamic, participatory, action-based model where making disciples is everyone's job, the core work.
Right, and it forces you to consider the difficulties, the big changes potentially needed to shift priorities and structures in that direction.
Things like reskilling people, maybe restructuring whole organizations, possibly making tough decisions about roles, even paid positions. The source asks those hard questions directly.
It does, and it definitely encourages a radical rethink about money and resources.
Its power to hinder, its potential to help.
And that really challenging principle that maybe, just maybe, the resources you think you lack are actually waiting to be found and mobilized in the harvest.
This material certainly gives you a lot to chew on. It challenges some very basic assumptions about how ministry works, who does it, how it's led, and where the resources come from.
It really does. And the sources kind of leave us with one final provocative thought to mull over.
What's that?
It's the idea that where there is no seed sowing, there can be no harvest, even though denominations organize harvest programs.
Wow. So, no matter how much structure or programming you have for the harvest, if nobody is actually doing the foundational work of sowing the seed and making disciples, then nothing is going to grow.
That's the implication. It puts the absolute necessity of that core activity front and center. Everything else depends on it.
Definitely something to think about further.